Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the One Water Perspectives webinar series. We're excited to continue to hear from thought leaders, regional managers, policymakers, and practitioners from across the country and are eager to learn more about their local accomplishments, lessons learned, and activities currently underway in their region. We are continuing our series today with a presentation from Alan Cohn, member of the UN New York City Regional Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and delighted he could join us today. Please be sure to join us next week when we sail to the South Florida Water Management District to learn more about sea level rise, climate change, and water resources management from Chief Modeler, Dr. Obi Sakura. For those of you who are new to our webinar series, I'm just going to cover a few housekeeping items. First, we are recording each webinar and posting them to our YouTube channel. A link will be added to the UN webinar webpage and disseminated as soon as it's available. And second, all participants have entered this webinar muted, so please enter your questions in the chat queue and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Barring any technical difficulties, I'll actually try to turn on your microphone so you can ask your questions directly to Alan. And with that, I am excited to introduce our presenter for today, Alan Cohn. As Directing Manager for Integrated Water Management, Alan develops projections, guidelines, and programs for population growth and climate change. The Integrated Water Management team spearheads innovative partnerships and incentives to reduce system demand, protect critical infrastructure, and promote awareness and sustainable water measures in the built environment. The group's initiatives include a demand management program to conserve 20 million gallons of water per day by 2022, a water reuse grant to encourage buildings to save water and reduce their impact on the environment, and a Cloudburst pilot program in partnership with the City of Copenhagen to manage flooding caused by heavy rain events. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan. I know we can hear you loud and clear, so go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, for the enthusiastic introduction. I'm looking forward to talking about our work today in New York City on climate resilient water management. For those of you that are not familiar with the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, we are the largest combined water and wastewater utility in the United States with 6,000 employees and an annual budget of more than $1 billion. Our water supply is an extensive system coming from approximately 2,000 square miles of watershed north of New York City, including 19 reservoirs and 3 controlled lakes that deliver almost 1 billion gallons per day of water to 9 million New Yorkers and maintain 7,000 miles of water mains. Our wastewater treatment system is similarly extensive. We have 14 wastewater treatment plants in the city that collectively treat almost 1.3 billion gallons per day of wastewater. We have 96 pumping stations and over 7,500 miles of sewers. In addition to the department's responsibilities for water supply, stormwater management, and wastewater treatment, we also have responsibilities of enforcing the New York City Air Pollution Control Code to reduce local emissions, enforcing the New York City Noise Code, and regulating hazardous wastes. So I start with this picture of New York City's waterfronts. Water really has been central to the development of New York City. Without our extensive reservoir system and upstate system, the city could not have grown to the size that it is today. Along with the technologies that have improved our drinking water supply, we've also continued to improve our wastewater treatment technologies and improve public health, which have enabled a return to the waterfront you see here for recreation, parks, and climate resilient development. Climate change adds a new dimension in that we either have too much or too little water, be it drought or heavy rain or sea level rise. Not only do we need to reduce our contribution to climate change, we also have to prepare for its impacts. This increases the pressure as well as the opportunity to consider new water management approaches. So while water that flows from our reservoirs and rainwater that falls on the city is collected, treated, and ultimately discharged to New York Harbor, we're developing an increasingly circular system wherein wastewater treatment plants are becoming resource recovery plants And green infrastructure is harvesting rainwater to reduce pollution as well as beautify the communities and reduce urban heat islands. There's a number of benefits that come along with collecting rainwater as its source, as opposed to sending it to a treatment plant where it will increase greenhouse gas emissions and treatment needs. We have a range of challenges that we have to think about as a water utility, and many of these are common to many places across the country and across the world, although the context certainly varies. In some cases, these are competing priorities as well. For instance, climate change adds a new pressure to reduce water use, particularly when it comes to issues like drought. However, selling water is our primary means of revenue that we invest back into the system. So that's something that we always have to balance. Similarly, regulatory mandates tend to focus on water quality in New York Harbor, but particularly after Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, we're seeing increasing but unmandated pressures to focus on flood mitigation. So we have these very disparate challenges where we have to seek to optimize our solutions, and that's really what I'm going to focus upon. So for over a decade and through 2 mayoral administrations, we continue to face these challenges head-on through sustainability programming and developing the various plans you see here to cultivate a more sustainable future. DEP is continuing to proactively reduce greenhouse gas emissions, stormwater runoff, and drinking water demand, and prepare for the impacts of extreme weather to drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. These plans will focus on specific sustainability measures for part of the water cycle. So now we are in the process of uniting these plans and the individual goals highlighted in each plan, which really brings me to One Water, which is the subject of this series. The One Water framework, many of you are likely familiar with. It allows us to seek ways to balance competing needs and future risks while making the best of our existing resources. We follow very much the One Water framework that has been defined in several ways. But the Water Research Foundation has defined it as an integrated planning and implementation approach to managing finite water resources for long-term resiliency and reliability, meeting both community and ecosystem needs. And the various circles you see around One Water are the types of considerations that we have to take into account when we use this framework for planning our initiatives for the coming years. One of our primary goals is to find the synergies between various facets of water management, including climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, and incorporate our work into the broader context of how the city is planning for its future. So today I'm going to use the lens of climate change to really frame the measures that we are taking, including our integrated water management approaches. I'll start with drought. This is a picture from the Camsville Reservoir, which is one of our 19 reservoirs, in 2001. Our area is subject to periodic drought. However, the climate projections for the coming decades do project an increase in precipitation. However, we do need to plan and analyze for drought patterns and changes in temperature that may lead to decreased winter snowpack and longer growing seasons that will potentially reduce the availability of water to refill reservoirs to meet our summer demand. DEP not only needs to meet the city's drinking water needs, but our responsibilities extend beyond the city boundaries. We divert or release water from the system to supply communities outside of the city, maintain flow in the Delaware River, support fishery habitats and recreation, generate electricity, and also enhance flood mitigation provided by the dams to downstream communities. So there's a lot of different pressures, and that is something which is clearly a common theme to this presentation so far. So one of the most straightforward resiliency approaches is demand reduction or demand management. Since 2009, water usage in New York City has actually been below that of 1966, which was our drought of record. Water use reduction is in large part due to metering, which started in earnest in 1985, as well as a toilet replacement program that ran from 1994 to 1997 and was reinstated in 2014, and improved overall water efficiency of the new building stock. Today, we continue to drive down demand through system optimization and fixture replacements at schools and other public facilities, as well as residential buildings, which I'll talk about in just a moment. We've reduced demand by 9.5 million gallons per day since 2014, and our 2017 average daily demand was 990 million gallons per day, the lowest it's been in at least 50 years. This is particularly noteworthy because the 2017 census estimate says that we officially hit the 8.6 million people mark, which is higher. The highest has been on record, and this continues a 7-year increase that we haven't seen since the first half of the 20th century. So as well as our overall consumption decreasing, our per capita consumption also continues to decrease. So one of the ways that we're doing this, as I've mentioned, is through a demand management program, which has reduced almost 10 million gallons per day since 2013, and we plan to double this amount by in the next 5 years. Our updated demand management plan is actually coming out on June 1st of this year, so keep an eye out for that. There's several strategies that comprise the demand management plan. First is a municipal retrofit program where we work with partners such as the ones I've mentioned, parks, schools, and so forth, to retrofit older and efficient facilities, as well as looking for special projects such as a water reuse system at a New York City Fire Department training facility, which we recently implemented. We work with the residential sector. I mentioned the toilet replacement program. That is something that we continue to do, working to replace inefficient fixtures in multifamily buildings. We also work with the non-residential sector to create voluntary conservation programs and provide cost-sharing incentives. This includes several challenges that we've run over the years, such as a hotel challenge, a hospital challenge, and a restaurant challenge, to ask those particular sectors to reduce their water use by at least 5%, and then we recognize a winner who reduces the most, as well as document best practices learned over the process of working with them. System optimization is critical, continuing leak detection, as well as pressure management and metering. Water supply management, we do have the options to adopt water shortage emergency rules, which are being revised not just to be able to respond to times of drought, but times where infrastructure may also experience problems. And then we work with our wholesale customers north of New York City to develop and implement demand management plans. Currently, we have 10 communities in north of New York City that we are working with to develop those plans. So shown here is a picture from our work with the Parks Department. Again, in addition to replacing and recycling toilets, we are also retrofitting spray showers at playgrounds so that they only run when kids press a button to make it work instead of running all day. We've retrofitted 400 spray showers, and this alone we estimate has saved the city over 1 million gallons per day. So one of the other benefits of saving water, which is not as widely recognized, is actually on the wastewater side. This image shows the demand management projects that we've implemented tributary to one of our 14 wastewater treatment plants, the Newtown Creek wastewater treatment plant. We estimate that demand management, due to our programs our investments over the last 5 years, have saved over 200 million gallons of water per year that are treated at the plant. We have a nifty tool which is available on our website called the Water Energy Nexus tool at the web link on the bottom of the screen, which I'll show again later. And we've used that to actually estimate that the savings to the both from reduced treatment at water treatment facilities as well as reduced pumping and treatment to the wastewater treatment plant actually saves over 22 metric tons of carbon dioxide each year. Keep in mind, this is only one of our wastewater treatment plants, one of 14, and we estimate that our citywide savings so far since over the 5 years of implementation of the demand management program are about 65 metric tons of carbon dioxide each year. So shifting gears somewhat, many older cities like New York have combined sewer systems in which the sewers accept a combination of both sanitary and stormwater flows. So this is water that comes from homes, is collected on the streets, and is typically sent to a wastewater treatment plant. However, during heavy rain events, the sewers have a mechanism that allows the combination of sewage and stormwater to spill into untreated into the harbor, which is actually a relief mechanism to protect the biological treatment process and treatment plants and to prevent sewage backups and flooding. Source controls can limit investments in large underground infrastructure. Shown here is a green infrastructure installation, one of thousands in New York City, which collects runoff from the street and allows it to infiltrate into the ground instead of being sent to a wastewater treatment plant or to a combined sewer overflow. In addition to looking at green infrastructure as a source control, we're increasingly starting to consider the impacts of demand management in limiting the impacts of combined sewer overflows. One of the ways we're doing this is through what we're calling our WAIT pilot program. Essentially, what we're doing is asking people to wait to use water during a heavy rain event. So during any rain event, real-time automated rainfall data is collected at a weather station at each of our 14 wastewater treatment plants. For our pilot, that real-time data from each plant is transmitted to our headquarters during heavy rain events, and when the combined sewer overflow event threshold is reached, our text messaging system sends an automated text alert to all participants asking them to please wait. The text message say something to the effect of, uh-oh, this rain is pretty heavy, please wait to use water. Remember, do laundry later, take shorter showers, delay the dishes, and wait to flush. Thanks for being a hero. At the end of the combined sewer overflow event, and when our wastewater treatment plants return to standard dry weather operating procedures, our text messaging system sends a second automated text alert to all participants, thanking them for waiting. That message says, all clear, the heavy rain is over, thanks for waiting, you're a real hero. So again, this is one of the first programs that is that we've used to actually make this linkage between drinking water use and combined sewer overflow, and incorporate not just the physical measures that we can implement in response to some of these chronic issues and emerging issues with climate change, but also incorporating the public and having the public help mitigate some of these impacts. One of the other programs that we are Piloting is a water reuse, on-site water reuse grant pilot program, which provides commercial, mixed-use, and multifamily residential properties incentives to install on-site water reuse systems. Water reuse systems, as you may know, sometimes called water recycling systems, make more efficient and safe use of rainwater, black water, or gray water. DEP's grant program promotes the construction of these systems at both the building scale and district scale by covering a portion of the capital costs. We also offer an incentive for operators of these systems to actually save 25% on their water bill for a system that reduces water usage at least 25% from the baseline. Grants for water use systems are available at the building and district level, as I mentioned. We offer up to $250,000 for a system designed to save at least 32,000 gallons of water per day. And then for district scale projects that typically involve 2 or more parcels, we offer up to $500,000 for a system designed to save at least 94,000 gallons per day. So again, these have the integrated benefits of saving potable water that doesn't need to be used for non-potable uses such as flushing, of collecting stormwater that would otherwise contribute to combined sewer overflow and have to be treated at a wastewater treatment plant, and overall contributing to our integrated water management goals. So shifting gears into another climate extreme, coastal surge and coastal flooding is probably the climate impact that most people in New York are familiar with after Hurricane Sandy in 2012. This is a picture from our Coney Island our Coney Island wastewater treatment plant, where a boat had washed onto the premises of the facility. Not only did Sandy cause loss of life and damage across the city, but our impacts to the agency specifically included 10 of DEP's 14 wastewater treatment plants were damaged or lost power, which released untreated or partially treated wastewater into local waterways and caused more than $130 million in damage. Other facilities across the area actually fared quite a bit worse. The Bay Park wastewater treatment plant in Nassau County sustained over $700 million in damage during Hurricane Sandy. And one thing we have to keep in mind is that another storm approaching from a different direction, along with sea level rise, could have more severe consequences for other facilities that were not necessarily as badly affected this time. One thing that's interesting to note is that over a foot of the flooding from Hurricane Sandy is attributable to sea level rise since 1900s. So as sea levels continue to increase, coastal storms will cause flooding over a larger area and at increased heights than they otherwise would have. So we have a mix of concurrent and interrelated steps that we've been using to protect our infrastructure from future events. The first is creating and applying a resiliency design standards. This is something that we did immediately after Sandy, and which you'll see in the following slide, and is something that we apply to all of our new projects at wastewater treatment facilities. As a side note, the city is also developing citywide climate resilience design guidelines, which were first released in April of last year, so that all agencies are using a consistent approach. So where feasible, we are incorporating these resiliency measures and standards into projects that are already in the planning phase or design phase. As I mentioned, anytime a new project comes up, we incorporate our standards. To implement the first step that we took also after Sandy, besides developing a design standard and applying it to all existing projects was to inventory all the projects across the city that require flood protection, and then identify and secure funding for implementation. So our design standard was an internal document called the Design Guideline for Crucial Equipment, adopted in 2013, which protects to the 100-year base flood elevation plus 30 inches of sea level rise, which is a relatively high projection for the 2050s, but starts to become a more middle-of-the-road projection as you get further out into the latter decades of the century. As I mentioned, in 2017, the mayor's office issued citywide preliminary climate resiliency design guidelines, which actually recommends protecting to the 100-year base flood elevation plus 40 inches of 40 inches. 30 inches of that is sea level rise, and 10 inches of that is freeboard. Since those guidelines were issued, we updated our own design guidelines accordingly and are seeking opportunities to incorporate that into new projects. This is a picture of the New York City Wastewater Resiliency Plan, which we issued in October 2013, a year after Sandy. We were already starting to assess the impacts of storm surge and other climate impacts on wastewater treatment facilities when Sandy hit, and then quickly mobilized to expand that study citywide after the storm. So we didn't just look at which facilities were damaged and what we needed to do to repair them. Rather, we took a climate-based approach to look at what facilities could be affected in future storms. So we based this approach on the 100-year floodplain plus 30 inches of sea level rise, and we assessed which assets were at risk if a storm below that threshold were to hit. We found that all of our 14 wastewater treatment plants were at some risk, and about 60% of our pumping stations were also at risk. Finally, we performed an adaptation analysis to see what adaptation measures should be taken to reduce the risks to these assets and facilities while being cost effective. So the results of this study is a portfolio of adaptation approaches described in the plan, including elevating and flood-proofing critical equipment. As I mentioned, we took a cost-effective approach where feasible. So for the most critical assets, we took the most protective approach, typically regardless of cost, whereas for the less critical assets, we sought a balance of flood protection and cost effectiveness. The plan showed that by investing just over $300 million in flood protection, we could avoid $1 billion in damage if all of these assets were to be inundated by floodwaters. However, factoring in the probability of flooding from multiple storm events over the year, we estimated that the damages avoided over 50 years could amount to approximately $2.5 billion. Making the business case was really critical for justifying investment, and we were able to secure just over $160 million in funding that became available after Hurricane Sandy to implement part of this plan. So the next extreme I'll talk about is inland flooding. Sandy was not a rain event, but one thing to keep in mind is that the next storm will be different. It may be another coastal event, but that comes from a different direction and causes flooding in other parts of the city. It could be a rain event, or it could be both. We've had a couple of near misses over the last couple of years. Hurricane Irene in 2011 would have been far more severe in New York City had we received the 16 inches of rain that we received in parts of the New York City watershed, as well as extreme flooding in parts of New England. A few years later, in August 2014, Long Island just east of New York City received over 13 inches of rain in less than 24 hours. So we know that New York City is at risk from these types of events, that sea level rise exacerbates the events in that it is more difficult to drain, and that climate change may also enhance the changes in high intensity rain events. So one of the ways that we're looking to mitigate these extreme rain events is through design modifications. So while we don't have a water square like the one shown here from Rotterdam just yet, these are the types of approaches that we're looking at, seeking best practices from across the country and across the world to try to manage and store water on site, knowing that it's becoming increasingly difficult to drain as time goes on and climate changes. The water square, for those of you not familiar, is designed to be dry on a typical day like this one, or even on a day with light rain. It's used as a basketball court. There's a school, there's a church next door that all use it. However, in an extreme rain event, it will actually fill up to the top with rainwater and thereby reduce flooding in nearby streets. This is an extreme rain event, not from New York, but from Copenhagen. In 2011, Copenhagen had almost 6 inches of rain in 3 hours, with damages close to $1 billion. What's interesting about this is that in response, Copenhagen issued a citywide cloudburst management plan, which set forth a strategy to utilize a mix of gray and green infrastructure to absorb and convey stormwater from heavy rainfall events, or what they call cloudbursts. Shown here is the city's first water plaza after a heavy rainstorm. You can see the retention basin in the picture on the right is designed to fill with water during intense rainfall. Currently, Copenhagen is working towards implementation of 300 projects like the one shown here in order to manage flooding from rainwater. You may recall the picture I showed earlier of one of our green infrastructure projects. And what's interesting is that the green infrastructure that we are using to manage combined sewer overflow does not look all that different from what they're doing in Copenhagen. The primary difference being that our systems are designed to infiltrate the first inch of runoff, whereas these are designed to retain even more than that to manage the 100-year storm projected out to the next century. So recognizing that each of our cities has experienced extremes, New York had Sandy, Copenhagen had their cloudbursts. These were different events, and we're both taking different approaches to respond to them, as well as our ongoing water quality and drainage issues. We actually decided to form a partnership with Copenhagen. We signed a memorandum of understanding, and shown in this picture, in March 2016, we held our first workshop to swap best practices. Particularly from New York's perspective, we were interested in how Copenhagen's approach may be translated to New York. So through our partnership with Copenhagen, we seek to exchange innovative ideas and ask, how can we develop more effective and extensive green infrastructure to supplement the sewer system and also reduce flooding? And how can we most effectively target high-risk areas? So the first thing we did upon working with Copenhagen is we actually brought on board a consultant, Ramble, that had conducted work in Copenhagen and helped develop their Cloudburst Management Plan to focus on New York City specifically and apply Copenhagen's methodology to New York. First, we looked at cities across the world so that we were understanding not just how Copenhagen is preparing for these events, but also these other cities. The second column indicates the year that they started adaptation planning in earnest. The middle column is what they call the extreme rain events. Copenhagen, as far as we know, is really the only one that says cloudburst, but this is a term we've taken to in New York as well. And the next column is the return period for the drainage system. So in most cities, they're not tearing up their drainage systems and installing pipes that can manage a 100-year storm. In most cases, that's impossible. So while we are making changes to the sewer system to take account climate change where feasible, we're also looking at these extreme events in defining what we use as our extreme event, whether it's the 100-year storm or the 10-year storm, and essentially looking at how we manage water above ground when those storms occur. This is sometimes known as a dual drainage approach. This image shows essentially that your sewer system continues to function after a 5-year event threshold, but it starts to back up essentially, so that after a 5-year event, while your sewers are slowly draining, your traffic space and your open areas also start to fill with water. And the principle behind the cloudburst management approach is that flooding becomes essentially intentional, so that you're directing water into the places where it minimizes damages to property and infrastructure. And the last row is showing that there will always be a bigger storm, no matter where you set your thresholds. You have to consider the most at-risk areas and what you can do to protect whatever property and infrastructure is in those locations. So based on the literature review that we conducted, we did decide to go ahead with Copenhagen's approach and look at a subsection of New York City. This, you can't really see where it is, but if you know John F. Kennedy Airport, this is an area directly north of John F. Kennedy Airport, home to about 700,000 people, so fairly sizable. And we actually developed a small master plan to illustrate how we could flow and retain water safely through the streets and open space network. While we're not moving into full implementation just yet, we are moving forward with several pilot projects, the first being the New York City Housing Authority South Jamaica houses, which I will show in just a few more slides. The first step to the process was really not about complicated hydraulic mapping with the sewer network, but rather just looking at the topography of the area and showing where these thick green lines would end up. They're called flow lines, and they follow the topography, knowing that in an extreme event, your sewer systems are full and water is flowing over the surface. And what's really fascinating is when you compare this map to the historical maps of the area, you'll see that there were streams and wetlands which really closely followed the paths of where water is likely to go in an extreme event today. What we can't necessarily do is just tear up the street and see that there's a stream still flowing there. That's not necessarily the case. But what we can do is look at the nearby adjacent streets and open spaces and see if we can create alternate pathways for the water, as well as places where we can slow water before it gets into the places where it would cause the most flooding. This also gives us an opportunity not just to look at the hydraulic connections, but also at the social connections, such as wayfinding between existing green spaces and bike paths. And this was really critical to the success of Copenhagen's Cloudburst Management Plan. So the tools in the toolbox include some of the typical approaches, such as what we call here retention streets. Looks very similar to the typical green infrastructure that we're using in New York City today, as well as these central retention spaces, which are more like the plaza that I showed you from Copenhagen that can fill with water in an extreme event. There's also this idea of a cloudburst road, which is really recontouring the road, such as having the crown slope down instead of be highest in the middle. But no matter which way you do it, the idea is that you're essentially diverting overland runoff into these central retention areas. And then we still have to consider pipes in places where topography is not necessarily on our side, or gravity is not on our side, and where you still need to have this mix of gray and green infrastructure. So what we did is develop a series of projects, 68 projects actually, that consisted of these typologies throughout the area. And we ran the model before to look at the flooding on top of the property and infrastructure in the area, which shows the bright red spots. And then again, after, with the 68 projects implemented, we were able to show that the flooding is reduced and the risk is thereby reduced. And here again, we have the opportunity to make the business case that investing money in these types of projects can save money in the form of avoided damages. So I mentioned the pilot projects. Our first pilot project at New York City's Housing Authority's South Jamaica houses will be designed to manage runoff from large events. The project will manage floodwater in an area where it could be collected in a large retention area. Our conceptual plan also identifies several adjacent properties that may present future opportunities to direct this flow. And so we look at things like bike paths and gardening and ways to activate the community in addition to having this function and mitigate flooding. So this is how South Jamaica houses appears today. This particular area is underutilized, and while it is green, it doesn't hold much water compared to what it could. Whereas traditional green infrastructure manages the first inch of runoff in New York City, here we're going to look to manage a larger storm. So we have other green infrastructure projects in New York that look like this in some way, shape, or form, in that we have created an area that is planted not necessarily for gardening, but can create this amenity for the community. On a dry day, it's a more functional space, but on a wet day, the space is designed to flood safely. And so if we look to places like Copenhagen for inspiration, flooding instead of a nuisance becomes this happy picture, complete with ducks. And so my last point is that resiliency through peer learning is really critical. We've talked about our work with Copenhagen. That's an international exchange, but there's so much we've learned over the years from partnering with our cities throughout the U.S. This is a map showing the members of the Water Utility Climate Alliance. Austin showed up last only because they're the latest ones to join us. But our vision is stated as climate resilient water utilities, thriving communities. And so our mission is to collaboratively advance water utility climate change adaptation. We have several products, including a climate resiliency training series, several white papers that are available on our website. And these include Embracing Uncertainty, a case study of how climate change is shifting water utility planning, piloting utility modeling applications, how several utilities, including New York, have incorporated climate change into our modeling and planning for our water supply, and a decision support white paper from 2010. And our key messages, you can find our key messages as well as our white papers online at wucaonline.org, are that warming is here and now. Know your system and explore its vulnerabilities. Don't be afraid to ask questions that may be hard to answer. Plan for multiple futures. So while we think climate change is going in one direction for many variables, it's important to ask what if it goes in a different direction, and will our solutions still be robust? And capacity building and assessment are key parts of the adaptation equation. And so finally, on the note of WUCA's vision of resilient utilities and thriving communities, resiliency can come in many forms, including the more engineering-minded ones, such as recalibrating design standards, retrofitting at-risk infrastructure, and making the business case that investing money now can save money later. OneWater is really a complementary piece to promote resiliency in that it optimizes our existing resources. It encourages us to use interdisciplinary approaches for change and to lean on peer networks to learn new tricks that traditional approaches may not be the best solutions to the challenges of the future. And then again, finally, that the work that we're doing as water utilities can also help us contribute to more livable communities. And with that, I will take questions.
Great, thank you, Alan. That was fascinating. We've definitely had some questions trickle in throughout your presentation, and we apparently have some microphone issues. So I'm going to ask quite a few of these. The first one comes from Sebastian. He is wondering, as demand is increasing, so is revenue. How is New York City managing this challenge? Have you increased water rates? What other mechanisms do you apply to have financial, sustainable utility under increasing challenging environment and decreasing demand?
That's a great question.
I could break that up a little. That was long.
No, that's fine. I think that's a very good question and something I alluded to earlier in the presentation, in that we have these sometimes counteractive issues such as climate change encouraging us to reduce our water demand, but we also reduce the revenue that we collect that we can then invest back into the system. Again, this is something that we see utilities across the country, if not the world, facing, and many are turning to some innovative solutions, including fixed rates and stormwater fees that allow them to encourage essentially what becomes more resilient behavior. And so that is something we are also actively exploring to see what a more sustainable rate structure might be for New York City.
Great, thanks. I'm going to see Aditi. She is local here at our university. Aditi, should I ask you? Are you there?
Yes, I am. I read the New York Times piece on the WAIT program, and so I was interested to see you talking about it. And I think I remember from that piece that it was the demand reduction was about 5% during CSO events. So I was wondering if you think this approach is promising, or if you're going to try and get a larger demand reduction by expanding it. Thanks.
Yes, so that's correct. We had the first phase of the WAIT program from last year, from June 6th to November 30th. During that time, we had 13 combined sewer overflow events that lasted about 7 hours on average. We had about 370 participants, and we did record a 5% decrease in participant consumption from the baseline. So it is something we have, decided to continue doing as a in phase 2. Registration actually just ended at the end of March, and we're going to be collecting data. We've already started collecting data and have had a couple events from April until May of next year to see how the 5% number from last year compares this time. And we have over 700 participants this time around compared to the 370 last time. So as I mentioned, we think that this is part of the equation in helping, not just to have the city invest, large amounts of money in centralized infrastructure and green infrastructure, but really take this portfolio approach where behavior change and community awareness is part of the equation.
Okay, great. So we have another question about how you measured the risks of wastewater treatment plants.
Sure. So as I mentioned, the first part to measure the risks to the wastewater treatment plants was really a desktop and mapping analysis where we mapped all the facilities and what we knew about their elevations against the revised 100-year floodplain with 30 inches of sea level rise superimposed. So we at least got, sort of the subset of facilities at risk. And after that, we did detailed facility audits where we went to each of those facilities. We looked at all of the assets that we had, that were below that critical threshold, and we cataloged their elevation so that we knew what level storm in the future they may be susceptible to. And then came the adaptation analysis, where based on what type of asset that was and how critical it was to the functioning of the facility, as well as what elevation it was at. Also, the facility as a whole, whether it was near beaches. These were all factors that played in to how we came up with the series of strategies that included elevating and floodproofing equipment and so on. So it was definitely an extensive effort, but the results of that study paid off in that, having that plan in place really allowed us to mobilize for when the federal funding became available after Hurricane Sandy.
Great. We have a question about liability issues and how you deal with potential liabilities such as drowning hazard, especially for elderly and children who might come along when preparing the implementation of the Cloudburst Management pilot program.
That's a great question, and it comes up all the time when we have these discussions with other city agencies. Since we haven't moved forward into full implementation of the pilots just yet, we don't have a definitive answer to that just yet. But some of the principles are essentially to keep the water from not getting too deep, and from make sure that it drains down in less than 24 hours typically. In addition to that, there may be other measures that we have to take, such as installing, some borders around it to keep people from getting into that space. But I think more likely is that we'll be able to manage the depths by seeking, a balance between storing water in a distributed area rather than in one centralized location, and where we do want to keep it in sort of a central retention area, it may be a mix of underground and above ground storage. For instance, a basketball court with some storage underneath that would fill up first, and then only in an extreme event would have a couple of inches of runoff on the top, but then there would be a safety mechanism or where that would then go back, would flow back into the sewer, so that we wouldn't allow it to get too deep.
Great. We have another question from Molly, and I'm going to try to turn her mic on. Molly, can you give it a try?
Hi, this is actually Eli. We're a group watching.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so I'm a college student actually from Johns Hopkins, studying electrical and computer engineering, but interested in these sorts of large utility scale issues. And I'm curious what your organization, Alan, most limits your ability to find the optimal solutions to these problems and then actually implement them as well. Are they funding issues, labor issues, research issues? Thank you.
I would say all of the above, yeah, I think the one that comes up the most is funding. Another one that comes up is maintenance, and certainly research. The city is often in the mode of responding to today's problems. So where does it flood today? Where's there underserved areas as far as infrastructure? Where do we have regulatory mandates that we have to fulfill? And what was the last one? I'm blanking. but essentially these sort of competing needs that we really have to respond to today before doing the research to get to what are the problems of the future. But I think in some of the work that we're doing, asking the questions about what does the future hold can still allow us to really get at today's issues as well. Like for instance, the Southeast Queens area that we focused our Cloudburst work. This is one of those areas that is underserved when it comes to infrastructure, and we have a multi-decade effort to build out the sewer systems. But we see these Cloudburst solutions being able to provide a near-term solution, as well as when the sewer system is fully built out, then it becomes an additional buffer above and beyond the sewers. Funding it is definitely an issue. We typically have to tie it to a regulatory program. A lot of our stormwater management programs, besides things like sewer build out, are tied to meeting Clean Water Act requirements. So in this area, it's a separately sewered area, and so we also have to seek to mitigate pollutants from runoff that would otherwise go directly into the harbor. But I think it's finding those synergies that allow us to kind of tap into existing funding streams where other funding streams aren't available. And then maintenance is always a topic that comes up. Thankfully, due to our green infrastructure program that's already been in place since 2012, we already have partnership agreements in place, for instance, with the New York City Housing Authority, where my agency has agreed to maintain these projects for the New York City Housing Authority.
Great, and we have one last question. This is actually from Mazdak. He was wondering if, to your knowledge, has any study assessed the effects of projected sea level rise on CSO occurrence and compliance?
Sure. So we actually did look at that as part of the study that was underway when Hurricane Sandy hit, and we found that, oddly enough, the sea level rise would tend to close the tide gates, which are in place to prevent seawater from getting into the sewers and going to the wastewater treatment plants, and could actually reduce combined sewer overflow. That's not necessarily a good thing because, again, those combined sewer outfalls are there for a reason, to avoid backup and to avoid overwhelming the wastewater treatment plant. We're really in the mode right now of responding to the kind of more present issue in our mind, which is the more extreme flooding, but certainly issues like that related to more chronic sea level rise are ones that we also have to consider when we think about how to adapt to climate change.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we had, which was quite a few. So thank you for your time, everybody. We hope you all can tune in next week. We appreciate your time today, Alan, and we'll be sure to send out a link once we get this webinar posted to our YouTube channel. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.